The heat in Babylon was stifling on that fateful day in June 323 BC. Inside the opulent palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the air was thick with the smell of incense and the heavy silence of impending doom. Alexander the Great, the man who had conquered the known world, lay upon his deathbed, his body ravaged by a sudden and mysterious fever. His generals, the men who had bled beside him from the sands of Egypt to the rivers of India, stood in a circle around him. Their faces were etched with a mixture of grief and predatory ambition. They watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest, waiting for the final breath that would shatter the world order. The stakes could not have been higher for the men standing in that room. The empire Alexander had built was a colossus stretching from the rugged mountains of Macedonia to the fertile plains of the Punjab. It was a political entity of unprecedented size and complexity, holding together a patchwork of cultures, languages, and religions through the sheer force of one man's will. Without an adult heir to take the throne immediately, the vast territories were in danger of instant fragmentation. The treasury in Babylon alone held 50,000 talents of silver, a fortune capable of raising armies that could crush kingdoms. Whoever controlled the body of the king and the symbols of his power would control the destiny of millions. Among the gathered elite was Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, who stood closest to the dying king. He was a man of rigid discipline and traditional Macedonian values, believing firmly in the unity of the empire. Nearby stood Ptolemy, a shrewd and calculating general who had been a childhood friend of Alexander, but now harbored thoughts of securing his own slice of the pie rather than preserving the whole. There was also Seleucus, the commander of the elite infantry guard, whose ambition was currently masked by his lower rank. These men, along with Antigonus the One-Eyed and Antipater back in Europe, were the Diadochi, or successors. They were the wolves waiting for the shepherd to die so they could devour the flock. As the life drained from his eyes, Alexander was asked to whom he left his vast kingdom. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words he spoke would ignite 4 decades of brutal warfare. He reportedly gasped out the words to the strongest. With a trembling hand, he passed his royal signet ring to Perdiccas, giving the senior general a tenuous claim to the regency. But the ambiguity of his final statement hung in the air like a curse. To the strongest was not a legal will or a clear succession plan. It was a challenge. It was an invitation for the most ruthless and capable among them to carve out their destiny with the edge of a sword. The immediate aftermath of the king's death was a chaotic scramble for legitimacy and survival. Perdiccas moved quickly to consolidate his power, proposing that they wait for the birth of Alexander's unborn child by his wife Roxana. If it was a boy, he would be king. The infantry, however, led by a man named Meleager, rejected this plan and demanded that Alexander's half-brother Philip Hideous be crowned immediately despite his mental disabilities. The palace in Babylon turned into a standoff between the cavalry loyal to Perdiccas and the infantry supporting Hideous. Blood was almost spilled in the throne room before a fragile compromise was reached. Both the unborn child and the disabled brother would rule as joint kings. This partition of Babylon was a facade of unity, covering deep fissures of resentment. Perdiccas assumed the role of regent, effectively becoming the ruler of the empire, while the other generals were assigned satrapies or governorships to keep them distant and pacified. Ptolemy requested and received the wealthy province of Egypt, a strategic masterstroke that would serve him well. Lysimachus was sent to Thrace to deal with barbarian tribes. Antigonus the One-Eyed was confirmed in his satrapy of Phrygia in Anatolia. Each general departed Babylon with a retinue of soldiers and a heart full of suspicion. The empire was technically intact, but in reality, it had just been divided into personal fiefdoms. The tension finally snapped over the matter of Alexander's funeral cart. Perdiccas had commissioned a magnificent golden carriage to transport the king's embalmed body back to the royal tombs in Macedonia. It was a symbol of legitimacy, for whoever possessed the body held the spiritual mandate to rule. As the procession moved slowly through Syria, Ptolemy bribed the escort and hijacked the corpse, diverting it to Memphis in Egypt. This was an open act of rebellion. Perdiccas could not let such an insult stand. He gathered the grand army and marched south to invade Egypt, determined to crush Ptolemy and reclaim the body of the king. The First War of the Diadochi had begun. The invasion of Egypt was a disaster for Perdiccas and marked the first major turning point in the wars. The Nile River proved to be a more formidable foe than the armies of Ptolemy. During a failed attempt to cross the river near the fortress of Camel Fort, over 2,000 of Perdiccas' men were swept away by the current or devised by crocodiles. The morale of the army plummeted. Disgusted by his incompetence and failure, 3 of his own officers, including Seleucus, marched into his tent that night and stabbed him to death. The man who had tried to hold the empire together was the first of the great marshals to fall victim to the ambition of his peers. With Perdiccas dead, the remaining generals met at Triparadisus in Syria to redistribute the map. This conference in 321 BC solidified the partition of the empire. Antipater, the old viceroy of Macedonia, was named the new regent. Ptolemy was confirmed in Egypt. Seleucus was rewarded for his betrayal of Perdiccas with the satrapy of Babylon, the wealthy heart of the east. Antigonus the One-Eyed was made commander of the royal army in Asia and tasked with hunting down the remaining supporters of Perdiccas. The unity of the empire was now a polite fiction. The generals were no longer serving a central authority, they were building independent kingdoms. Antigonus the One-Eyed soon emerged as the most powerful figure in Asia. He was an old man in his 60s, but he possessed the energy of a youth and the tactical brilliance of Alexander himself. With the royal army at his back, he swept through Anatolia and Syria, crushing anyone who opposed him. His growing power alarmed the other satraps. The balance of power was shifting dangerously. If Antigonus was not stopped, he would achieve what Perdiccas had failed to do and unite the entire empire under his own rule. The other generals watched with growing unease as the one-eyed giant swallowed province after province. The resistance against Antigonus was led by a unique figure named Eumenes of Cardia. Unlike the other Diadochi, Eumenes was a Greek, not a Macedonian, and he had served as Alexander's personal secretary rather than a field commander. Despite his lack of royal blood and military pedigree, he was a brilliant strategist and fiercely loyal to the royal family. He managed to secure the loyalty of the Silver Shields, an elite unit of veterans who had fought under Alexander. For years, Eumenes led Antigonus on a chase across the Zagros Mountains and into the plains of Iran, fighting a guerrilla war that tested the limits of the one-eyed general's patience. The conflict between Antigonus and Eumenes culminated in the Battle of Gabion in the salt deserts of Iran. It was a battle decided not by tactics but by treachery. During the fighting, the Antigonid cavalry managed to flank the lines and capture the baggage train of the Silver Shields. This baggage contained all the loot these veterans had accumulated over 30 years of conquest, along with their wives and children. Desperate to recover their lives, the Silver Shields struck a deal with Antigonus. They handed over Eumenes in exchange for their baggage. Antigonus had his rival executed, and the last defender of the unified royal house was gone. While Asia burned, Europe was embroiled in its own brutal struggle. Following the death of the regent Antipater, his son Cassander initiated a war to seize control of Macedonia. Cassander was a man of cold calculation who held a deep hatred for the memory of Alexander. He found himself opposed by Olympias, the fierce mother of Alexander the Great, who sought to protect her grandson, the young King Alexander IV. The war between them was personal and savage. Olympias executed many of Cassander's supporters, but eventually she was besieged in the city of Pydna. Starved into submission, she was captured and executed by the relatives of her victims. Cassander was now the master of Macedonia, and he moved to extinguish the Argead dynasty forever. He imprisoned the young King Alexander IV and his mother Roxana in the citadel of Amphipolis. For years they languished in darkness, stripped of their royal status. Eventually, around 310 BC, Cassander ordered their secret execution. The bloodline of Alexander the Great, which had traced its ancestry back to Hercules and Achilles, was wiped from the face of the earth. The empire now belonged entirely to the generals. There was no longer a king to fight for only territory and power. With the royal family dead, the last pretense of unity vanished. Antigonus, the One-Eyed, now controlled all of Asia from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. His wealth was inexhaustible and his armies were invincible. In 306 BC, after a massive naval victory by his son Demetrius over Ptolemy at Salamis, Antigonus did the unthinkable. He proclaimed himself king. It was a declaration that he was the true successor to Alexander. Within months, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander followed suit, crowning themselves kings of their respective territories. The empire was officially dead, replaced by a collection of rival kingdoms. The ambition of Antigonus knew no bounds. He wanted it all. His son Demetrius, known as the Besieger, was his right-hand man. Demetrius was a charismatic and flamboyant warrior famous for building massive siege engines that terrified defenders. He laid siege to the island city of Rhodes, a wealthy trading hub allied with Egypt. The siege of Rhodes lasted a year and featured the largest war machines the world had ever seen, including a 9-story tall siege tower called the Hellepolis, or City Taker. Despite his technological marvels, Demetrius failed to take the city, but the metal from his abandoned siege engines was used to build the Colossus of Rhodes. The other kings realized that if they did not unite, they would be destroyed one by one. A grand coalition was formed against Antigonus and Demetrius. Lysimachus invaded Anatolia from Thrace, while Seleucus marched his army from Babylon, bringing with him 500 war elephants he had obtained from an Indian king. Cassander sent troops to aid the effort, while Ptolemy threatened the southern border. The stage was set for the final showdown. All the armies of the successor kingdoms were converging on a single point in Phrygia. The fate of the Hellenistic world would be decided in one afternoon of blood and dust. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC was the largest battle of the ancient world until that point. Over 80,000 men fought on the side of Antigonus against 70,000 allied troops. The earth shook as the massive phalanxes collided and the war elephants trampled through the lines. Antigonus, now 81 years old, but still commanding from the front, hoped for a decisive victory. However, the allied cavalry led by Seleucus managed to isolate the old king from his guards. As javelins rained down on him, a soldier asked Antigonus who would save him. He replied, "Demetrius will come." But Demetrius had been lured away from the battlefield. Antigonus, the One-Eyed, fell at Ipsus, pierced by multiple javelins. His death marked the end of the dream of reuniting Alexander's empire. His vast territories were carved up by the victors. Lysimachus took western Anatolia, Seleucus added Syria to his vast eastern domains, and Cassander secured his hold on Macedonia. Ptolemy solidified his control over the Levant. The world settled into a new geopolitical reality, dominated by 4 great powers. The era of the Diadochi was transitioning into the stable Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries. Yet peace was still elusive. The victors of Ipsus soon turned on each other. Lysimachus, who had built a powerful kingdom in Thrace and Asia Minor, became a tyrant in his old age. His court was filled with intrigue and murder, including the execution of his own son Agathocles. This act of familial cruelty alienated his subjects and gave Seleucus the excuse he needed to invade. The 2 last surviving companions of Alexander met at the Battle of Coropedium in 281 BC. It was a duel between 2 old men fighting for the last scraps of glory. Lysimachus was killed and his kingdom collapsed. Seleucus was now the last of the original Diadochi standing. He had outlived all his rivals and controlled more territory than any man since Alexander. He crossed the Hellespont into Europe, dreaming of claiming the throne of Macedonia and finally uniting the Asian and European halves of the empire. But just as he stepped onto European soil, he was assassinated by a renegade son of Ptolemy, whom he had welcomed into his court. With the death of Seleucus, the generation of Alexander's marshals was finally extinguished. They had spent 40 years fighting over a corpse, and in the end, none of them truly won. The chaos of the wars left a power vacuum in the north that invited a terrifying new threat. A massive migration of Celtic tribes, known as the Galatians, poured into the Balkans. They smashed through the Macedonian army, killing the king Ptolemy Antigonus and sticking his head on a pike. They rampaged through Greece, sacking the sacred site of Delphi before crossing into Asia Minor. The terror of the Gallic invasion forced the warring Hellenistic kings to temporarily pause their conflicts. It took years of fighting to contain the Celts, who eventually settled in central Anatolia in a region that became known as Galatia. Out of the ashes of the Diadochi Wars, three stable dynasties emerged. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt from their glittering capital at Alexandria. The Seleucids controlled a vast and diverse empire stretching from Syria to Afghanistan. The Antigonids, descendants of the one-eyed giant, eventually reclaimed the throne of Macedonia. These three kingdoms formed a balance of power that brought a fragile stability to the region. They fought frequent border wars, but the existential struggle for total domination was over. The map of the ancient world had been redrawn, and the Hellenistic Age had truly begun. The legacy of the Diadochi went far beyond the battlefields. In their quest for legitimacy and power, they founded hundreds of cities across Asia and Africa. These cities were modeled on the Greek polis, complete with gymnasiums, theaters, and agoras. They became centers of Greek culture and learning, spreading Hellenism deep into the non-Greek world. The fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions created a vibrant cosmopolitan culture that advanced science, art, and philosophy to new heights. The wars had destroyed the political unity of the empire, but they had created a cultural unity that connected the Mediterranean to the Indus. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of this new world. Under the patronage of the Ptolemies, the great library was built, gathering the knowledge of the human race under one roof. Scholars from across the known world flocked to the city to study mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. It was here that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth and Euclid wrote the elements of geometry. The ambition that had driven the generals to war was channeled into an ambition for knowledge and artistic grandeur. The lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world, stood as a beacon of this new age. The Seleucid Empire, though plagued by constant rebellions, served as a vital bridge between East and West. The Silk Road began to take shape during this period, connecting the markets of China with the Mediterranean. Greek artistic styles influenced Buddhist art in India, creating the unique Greco-Buddhist statuary of Gandhara. The coins of the Seleucid kings have been found as far away as Sri Lanka and Scandinavia. The world was becoming smaller and more interconnected. The violence of the Diadochi had inadvertently broken down the barriers between civilizations, paving the way for the first era of globalization. In Macedonia, the Antigonid dynasty maintained the martial traditions of Philip and Alexander. They served as the shield of Greece, protecting the southern city-states from the barbarian tribes of the north. However, their heavy-handed control over Athens and Sparta led to constant friction. The old city-states of Greece, once the center of the world, were now reduced to pawns in the games of kings. They formed leagues and alliances, trying to maintain some semblance of independence, but the era of the free polis was over. The future belonged to the superstates and the monarchs who commanded armies of professionals. The wars of the Diadochi also revolutionized warfare itself. The scale of conflict increased dramatically, with armies numbering in the tens of thousands. The siege engines developed by Demetrius changed the nature of city defense. War elephants became a standard feature of Hellenistic armies, acting as living tanks that could break enemy lines. The phalanx was deepened, and the sarissa pike was lengthened, making the formation even more impenetrable from the front, but more vulnerable on the flanks. These military innovations would dominate the battlefields of the Mediterranean, until they eventually encountered the flexible legions of a rising power in the west called Rome. Ultimately, the story of the Diadochi is a tragedy of ambition. These men were the best and brightest of their generation, gifted with immense talent and courage. Yet they squandered the legacy of Alexander in a fratricidal struggle that brought untold suffering to millions. They had the opportunity to build a universal state that could have guaranteed peace and prosperity, but they chose personal glory instead. They were giants walking the earth, but their footsteps left only blood and ruin. In their drive to be the strongest, they ensured that the empire they fought for would never be whole again. As we look back on the War of the Diadochi, we see the fragility of power. Alexander the Great built the largest empire the world had ever seen in just over a decade, but it did not survive him by a single day. The structures of empire are only as strong as the succession plan that supports them. The generals proved that without a unifying figure, even the most powerful state will tear itself apart. Their history serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the chaos that ensues when political legitimacy collapses. The Hellenistic world they created was a glittering mosaic of cultures, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The constant infighting between the Ptolemies, Seleucids, and Antigonids weakened them, all draining their treasuries and manpower. While they bickered over border towns and prestige, the Roman Republic was slowly consolidating its power in Italy. When Rome finally turned its gaze eastward, it found a divided world ripe for conquest. One by one, the great kingdoms of the successors would fall to the legions, ending the Hellenistic Age as violently as it had begun. The last of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra, would die 3 centuries later, marking the final end of the era initiated by Alexander's generals. But the echo of the Diadochi remains. They shaped the geography and culture of the Near East in ways that are still visible today. The cities they founded, the trade routes they opened, and the cultural synthesis they encouraged laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. They were the architects of a bridge between the ancient and the classical worlds. In the end, the War of the Diadochi asks us a fundamental question about the nature of leadership. Is greatness defined by the ability to conquer, or the ability to build something that endures? Alexander and his generals were supreme conquerors, but they failed as builders of a lasting peace. They remind us that the sword can win an empire, but it cannot keep it. True power lies not in the subjugation of others, but in the creation of a stable and just order that can survive the death of its founder. The dust has long settled on the battlefields of Ipsus and Corupedium. The golden armor of the kings has rusted away, and their palaces have crumbled into dust. But the story of their rivalry remains one of the most dramatic and instructive chapters in human history. It is a tale of loyalty and betrayal, genius and folly played out on the grandest stage imaginable. The Diadochi fought for the world, and in doing so they changed it, forever leaving behind a legacy that whispers to us across the centuries.